So what inspired me to create my system, my training system? Uh, well, so you have to start from scratch. So like I started training, I was 11, and then back then as a young teenager, I was like reading a bunch of like training books, a lot of magazines, and like you notice after a while you notice that there doesn't seem to be a lot of rhyme and reason behind the background of the training that you saw in these magazines or books. And as I progressed through my bachelor's degree, and during that time I would spend my weekends in the exercise science library reading books and reading and reading and reading. And you get to a point where you realize that a lot of the higher level education is very scientific. So it makes you understand principles of training, concepts of training, but still, I always felt that I didn't have a really good answer about how to write or design or periodize program. You would read books on periodization. They talk about what's a microcycle, what's a macrocycle, the Ancel concept and all these types of things. But I was always like, how do I write the program? And it was even the same thing with continuing education. Once I graduated in 2000 and I started doing more continuing education, I'm like, okay, but everything is abstract. It's just a bunch of tidbits, but how do I create something? And then I became working as a personal trainer in 1999 in this big commercial gym with 35 other trainers, and I was very focused on data and the minutia of training. And through my career, even more so when I progressed to training mostly professional athletes, what happened is I had a lot of free times during the off seasons where like now my training load with my clients was not as big because the athletes were in season. So I would spend that time analyzing, gathering data and looking at trends and trying to fine tune training so that I can get to a point where I can systemize the programming and the periodization of the training. Because I believe that as a coach, you need to be systematic, you need to be organized. And to be organized, you need a system. And when you have a system, then the chances of you messing up the programming of your athletes become less and less and less of a question. So overall, that's what inspired me. I wanted to finally have a very concrete way to periodize, plan, program design for long-term success in a repeatable fashion over time without never losing track of the goal, losing track of where I'm going. Sometimes if you don't have a system, you tend to be influenced by so many outside sources that your training over time is all over the place and the results are all over the place. What is the difference in loading between accumulation and intensification phases? So this is a complicated question in the sense that if we're talking about accumulation intensification, then we have to assume a undulating periodization model. So why I'm so focused on the intensities more so than the reps, because traditionally coaches using undulating periodization, they focus on the rep because it's true that the rep is king, the rep dictates the load. But the problem is I've noticed in the past that a lot of coaches creating undulating periodization programs by focusing on the reps would sometimes make mistake in the sense of intensity undulations. And what I mean by that is if I'm giving you a program that accumulation 1 is 7 reps, and then intensification 1 is 5 reps, and then accumulation 2 is 6 reps, and intensification 2 is 4 reps. Okay? So now we can all agree that the intensities are undulating, the reps are undulating during that 12-week phase, like from 7 to 5 to 6 to 4. Yes, it's undulating. But here's the problem. True undulating periodization, the purpose of undulating periodization, why you use it, is because the accumulation phase, you create a neuromuscular adaptation through volume. So volume is the main driver. But the problem with volume is also the one thing that you will overtrain from the fastest. So after a while, you need to deload the volume, and then you switch the focus through a neuromuscular adaptation through intensity. Hence the purpose of intensification phase. But then intensity, very heavy, very neurally demanding, harder on the joints. At one point, you need to back off all of the intensity and revert back to volume to deload the intensity aspect. So undulating periodization, it's all about stressing one end, deloading it, stressing the other end, deloading it, and back and forth. But if you really look at it, the 7-5-6-4 periodization, yes, it's undulating, but the reality is 7 reps. If you look at the intensity, and this is why I always focus on intensity, but 7 is 80% of 1 RM. 5 is 85. Okay, so now, from that phase to the other phase, you're going up only 5%. That's not very dramatic. That's not for the central nervous system, that's not a very huge jump in intensity, but it's still a jump. But now here's a problem. Now accumulation 2, you go back to 6. Well, 6, it's 83%. So now I said that the intensification phase, the purpose is to deload from that high intensity and revert back to volume. But if I'm going from 85 to 83, I'm not really deloading anything. It's almost basically the same intensity. And then last phase, 4 reps, you go from 83 to 88. So again, it's still very tight. So if you look at the entire macro, you're basically only training within that 80 to 88 range, the entire macro. So it's almost like old school 1920s, like standard periodization where you train at the same intensity the whole time. That is not undulating periodization. So now, finally, to answer your question, from accumulation to intensification, you need a big enough intensity jump so that the stimulus is different, but it also needs to be big enough so that the phase after, when you're backing off, there's room to back off. Because as you're progressing through a macro, the intensity should always go up as you're undulating. But in order to do that and truly deload, the jumps needs to be big enough to have enough room to do so. And now the extent at how much you're going to jump, then it depends on your training age. If you're a beginner, you cannot do crazy drastic jumps because the beginners, one, is knowledge of their load is not that great, and their neural ability is not good enough to be able to have huge drastic changes in intensity, and that being a great stimulus for them. So you need to be a little bit more conservative, although you need to be big enough so that the undulating counts as undulating. The intermediate, then it will be a little bit more. Now the advanced, he can afford to have way bigger jumps. He's going to be able to cope with the bigger jumps. But also if he's advanced, he's also stronger. So if you're doing an intensification phase at high intensity with a lot of weight, then it pays for the next accumulation to back off even more to deload these joints. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why the advanced can afford huge jumps in intensity. Now that being said, the specifics, generally speaking, from accumulation to intensification, the intensity jumps, the intensity increase should be anywhere from 8 to 15%. Obviously, depending on the training age, will tell you if you're closer to the 8 or closer to the 15%. What is my favorite rep scheme for hypertrophy and why? Well, I have 2, okay? And the 2 depends on where you fit in terms of training age. So my personal favorite rep scheme for hypertrophy is, it's a stage descending rep scheme, and it's the 8-8-6-6-4-4. But you have to understand that the longer your training age, the higher the intensity you can train at, and get good results in hypertrophy. So although the 8-8-6-6-4-4 stage descending average intensity is 83%, which falls at the end, the bottom range, if you want, of functional hypertrophy. For me, it's a very good rep scheme for hypertrophy because of my training age. Now with most people, like beginner or intermediate, I really like back off sets. And one that I really like, it's a brutal one. The volume is extremely high, but it works really well, especially for those beginners. So the rep scheme, it's a back off set. It's 12, 10, 8, 6, 15. So you do a descending rep scheme, so 12, 10, 8, 6. So you're basically tapping into mixed fiber type of motor units. And then after your 6, where you reach your peak of intensity, you back off in intensity all the way to 15 reps. Okay, so now that back off, although you build that intensity up to 6 reps, now that back off just allows you to finish that exercise by blasting more volume. Okay, so that's why the total rep of that rep scheme will be very high. We're talking about 51 reps, which will allow you to have a much greater hypertrophy response. So with a new athlete on the first year, if I have zero information, which upper body and lower body lift would I prioritize for the first 12-week macro? For me, it's simple. Upper body would be the overhead press, and lower body would be the squat. The overhead press, why? Because in my experience, almost everybody I've ever started training, they have a weak overhead press compared to the other 3 presses. And because I'm a fan of working on the weak link first, then it makes it very simple to choose the overhead press as the first thing to work on. And not only that, but the advantage of improving the overhead press, because that angle above your head is your weakest angle. If you get stronger there, it translates in getting stronger on the other angles as well. So to me, it's like a win-win situation. For lower body, it's the back squat, because what I like about the back squat, it's a very good standard exercise, which is why it's the mother lift when it comes to strength ratios. So not only am I training the movement that's the mother lift for strength ratios that I'm going to use later on to gauge all my other lower body lifts, but it's also between the deadlift and the front squat, it's the movement that requires the most mobility. Okay, so you need to have very mobile ankles, knee, hip, and shoulder joints to be very good at doing the Olympic style squat variation that I like with athletes. So by focusing the first 12 weeks on the back squat with the increased frequency of training it, especially in the intensification phase, only training twice a week, I find that my rate of progress at building a quality back squat and improved range of motion carry on to better performance later on if I'm trying to improve the front squat or deadlift or whatever it might be.